Welcome back to West Film, the channel dedicated to breaking down the movies that shaped generations, revisiting the films everyone still argues about, and digging up the stories behind the stories. From hidden franchise lore and honest reviews to deep dive recaps and film analysis that actually respects your intelligence, you'll find it all right here. If you love movies as much as we do, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Alright, grab your popcorn, get comfortable, and let's get into today's movie. The success of Conan established Schwarzenegger as one of the most recognizable faces in global entertainment. Another key member of the cast was James Earl Jones, who played the villainess Thulsa Doom. By the time he joined Conan the Barbarian, Jones was already an accomplished actor with a distinguished reputation in theater, film, and television. His deep, commanding voice had become famous worldwide thanks to his work voicing Darth Vader in Star Wars, though audiences rarely saw the face behind that iconic performance. Jones brought tremendous gravitas to Thulsa Doom. Rather than playing him as a simple, brutish warlord, he portrayed the character as a charismatic cult leader who manipulated people through words and psychological control. His calm, intelligent performance created a striking contrast with Schwarzenegger's more physical, instinct-driven hero. Whenever the two characters shared the screen, audiences witnessed a clash between raw strength and intellectual domination. The role also showcased Jones's remarkable range as an actor, equally at home in Shakespeare, dramatic theater, science fiction, and fantasy. His portrayal of Thulsa Doom remains one of the most memorable villains in fantasy cinema, precisely because he feels genuinely dangerous without relying solely on violence. His influence can still be seen in modern fantasy antagonists who combine charisma with cruelty. Sandahl Bergman played Valeria, one of the film's most beloved characters. Before Conan the Barbarian, Bergman was known primarily as a dancer and performer. She had worked extensively in theater, and her athletic background made her a natural fit for the physically demanding role. Unlike many female characters in fantasy films of the period, Valeria wasn't simply a romantic interest waiting to be rescued. She was a skilled warrior who fought alongside Conan as an equal. Bergman brought confidence, intelligence, and toughness to the part, helping redefine what audiences expected from women in fantasy adventures. Valeria was courageous, independent, and fully capable of defending herself, and the chemistry between Bergman and Schwarzenegger gave Conan's journey a stronger emotional dimension. Her performance earned significant recognition and established her as one of the film's standout performers. Many fans still consider Valeria one of the strongest female characters in early 1980s fantasy cinema. Jerry Lopez played Subotai, Conan's loyal companion and fellow adventurer. Before acting, Lopez was already famous as one of the world's greatest surfers and is often regarded as a pioneer of modern surfing culture. His move into acting mirrored Schwarzenegger's own transition from athletics to cinema. Lopez brought a calm, relaxed charisma to Subotai. While Conan relied on brute force, Subotai contributed intelligence, stealth, and archery skill. The friendship between the two characters supplied much of the film's humor and humanity, and Lopez's screen presence helped make Subotai one of its most likable figures. Mako played the wizard and also served as the film's narrator. By the time of Conan the Barbarian, Mako was already an experienced actor with an impressive body of work in film and television, known for bringing wisdom and emotional depth to supporting roles. His narration immediately sets the story's mythic tone, making audiences feel as though they're hearing an ancient legend passed down through generations. Mako's performance adds authenticity and atmosphere throughout, and his character functions as a guide connecting the audience to Conan's world. When Conan the Barbarian came out in 1982, fantasy still occupied a fairly small corner of mainstream cinema. Science fiction had already found huge success through films like Star Wars and Alien, but studios generally considered fantasy a riskier bet. There had been occasional fantasy productions, but few had achieved major commercial success until Conan helped change that. Over time, it became one of the most influential fantasy films ever made, shaping popular culture, inspiring countless imitators, influencing generations of filmmakers, and helping define the image of the fantasy hero for decades. One of the film's biggest contributions was popularizing the sword and sorcery genre. Stories about warriors, magic, monsters, and ancient civilizations had existed in literature for centuries, but Conan the Barbarian brought them to the big screen with a scale and seriousness few earlier films had attempted. Instead of treating fantasy as something whimsical or aimed mainly at kids, the movie presented its world as brutal, dangerous, and grounded, a proof that fantasy could appeal to adults just as much as historical epics or action films. That success encouraged studios to invest in similar projects throughout the 1980s. Films like The Beastmaster, Red Sonja, Cruel, Legend, Willow, and numerous lower-budget fantasy productions emerged in part because Conan had proven there was a market for sword and sorcery adventures. Even movies with a very different tone owed something to Conan's commercial success, which essentially created a blueprint many filmmakers tried to follow throughout the decade. The film also helped establish Arnold Schwarzenegger as one of the defining action stars of modern cinema. While he would later become famous for roles like The Terminator, Dutch in Predator, and John Matrix in Commando, Conan marked the first major step in his transformation from bodybuilder to global superstar. The character became an icon in his own right, and the image of Schwarzenegger as a powerful warrior became deeply embedded in popular culture. A sword in hand, standing atop a battlefield, facing overwhelming odds. That imagery turned up on countless posters, magazine covers, and ads, and became so widespread that even people who'd never seen the movie often recognized it. The film also reshaped how fantasy heroes were portrayed. Before Conan, many fantasy protagonists were noble knights or idealistic adventurers embodying traditional virtues. Conan was different, rough, flawed, violent, and driven by personal survival. He relied on instinct rather than education and succeeded through sheer determination, strength, and resilience. That archetype influenced countless characters that followed, and the muscular warrior wandering through dangerous lands became a recurring figure across fantasy books, films, comics, and video games, with characters throughout many franchises borrowing aspects of Conan's personality, appearance, or journey. The film's impact went well beyond cinema. Tabletop role-playing games, which already existed before the film, saw a boost in public interest in fantasy settings full of barbarians, ancient kingdoms, sorcerers, and epic battles, and many players and designers cite Conan as a major influence on their sense of fantasy storytelling. Video games were also heavily shaped by it. Throughout the 1980s, 90s, and even into the modern era, countless games have featured heroes strongly resembling Conan. Big swords, muscular protagonists, dark fantasy worlds, and stories built around revenge or survival became common tropes, and entire franchises built their identity around ideas Conan helped popularize. Even games that never referenced the character directly often reflect his influence in their visual design and storytelling. Comic books saw a similar effect. Conan already existed in comic form before the film, but the movie dramatically raised public awareness of the character, drawing new readers to the original stories and comics and strengthening his place as one of the most important figures in fantasy literature and visual storytelling. The movie also left a lasting mark on fitness culture. Bodybuilding was becoming more visible in mainstream society in the early 1980s, and Schwarzenegger's success as Conan helped link muscular physiques with heroism and cinematic appeal. Many young viewers took up weight training after seeing the film, and gyms, fitness magazines, and bodybuilding competitions all benefited from the growing popularity of athletic physiques during this period. Conan's influence can also be seen in how fantasy television evolved. Decades later, many shows adopted a darker, more realistic approach to fantasy storytelling. Apolitical intrigue, violence, moral ambiguity, harsh environments, reflecting ideas Conan helped bring into the mainstream. These later productions built their own identities, but they inherited a fantasy landscape Conan had helped reshape. One of the film's most enduring contributions is its famous dialogue. The line, often remembered as "what is best in life," became one of the most quoted moments in action movie history. Conan's response about crushing enemies, seeing them driven before him, and hearing the lamentations of their people entered popular culture almost immediately and has since turned up in TV shows, movies, comedy sketches, internet memes, sports commentary, and everyday conversation. The making of Conan the Barbarian is almost as fascinating as the story on screen. What audiences saw in theaters in 1982 was the result of years of development, ambitious creative choices, difficult filming conditions, and a remarkable collaboration between artists, athletes, actors, and filmmakers. The journey from concept to finished film was full of challenges, unexpected solutions, and stories that have since become part of film history. And looking behind the scenes shows how a fairly risky fantasy project evolved into one of the most influential adventure films ever made. The movie's origins trace back to the growing popularity of Conan as a literary and comic book character. Conan first appeared in stories written by Robert E. Howard in the 1930s, and over the following decades the character built a devoted following through novels, comics, and illustrated publications. By the late 1970s, producers saw potential for a major film adaptation, but translating Conan's world to the screen was no small challenge. Fantasy hadn't yet proven itself reliably successful at the box office, and building a believable ancient world would take serious resources. Producer Edward R. Pressman became one of the key figures behind the project. He believed Conan had the same mythological appeal that made characters like Tarzan and Hercules enduring icons, and he spent years developing the project and searching for the right creative team, weighing various scripts and concepts before the film finally entered serious production. One of the most important decisions was hiring John Milius as director. Milius already had a reputation as one of Hollywood's most distinctive filmmakers, known for his outsized personality and fascination with history, warfare, and mythology, making him uniquely suited to Conan's world. He approached the material not as a simple fantasy adventure but as an epic myth, wanting the film to feel ancient, timeless, and legendary. That vision shaped nearly every part of the production. Rather than lean into flashy magic or fairy tale elements, Milius focused on realism, physicality, and atmosphere, wanting audiences to believe Conan's world could have existed in some forgotten corner of history, an approach that set the film apart from many fantasy productions that followed. Perhaps the most famous casting story involves Arnold Schwarzenegger. At the time, he was known primarily as a bodybuilding champion, not an actor. The filmmakers considered several performers for the role, but Schwarzenegger's extraordinary physique made him impossible to ignore, even though there were concerns about his acting experience and strong Austrian accent. Once Milius met him, he became convinced he'd found his Conan. Rather than try to turn Schwarzenegger into a conventional actor, Milius built the role around his strengths. Conan would speak relatively little, letting Schwarzenegger's physical presence carry much of the performance. Extensive training followed, including horseback riding, sword fighting, climbing, and combat choreography. The preparation the cast went through was unusually intense. Schwarzenegger trained for months before filming began, with daily sessions of strength training, weapons practice, and riding lessons. The filmmakers wanted the actors to do as many of their own stunts as possible, so the performers genuinely became skilled with swords and other weapons. The sword training in particular became legendary rather than lightweight prop weapons. Many scenes used heavy metal swords requiring real physical strength to wield. Schwarzenegger later described the training as one of the most demanding experiences of his career. Filming mainly took place in Spain, which offered the rugged landscapes needed to bring the Hyborian age to life. Various regions of the country provided mountains, deserts, forests, and ancient-looking terrain that matched the film's aesthetic goals and gave it a sense of scale that would have been hard to achieve on studio sets alone. The production moved frequently between filming locations, often working far from major cities, which added to the film's authenticity but also created logistical headaches, since equipment, costumes, animals, and personnel constantly had to be transported across difficult terrain. Weather added another obstacle. Some scenes were shot in intense heat, others in cold and harsh winds, and the long days outdoors tested everyone's endurance. Despite the difficulties, the natural environments enhanced the film's realism and remain one of its greatest strengths. Production design played a critical role in building Conan's world. Rather than leaning heavily on visual effects, the filmmakers built enormous practical sets, temples, palaces, villages, and fortresses that let actors interact directly with their surroundings, making the fantasy setting feel tangible and believable. One of the most impressive was the Temple of Set, headquarters of Thulsa Doom's cult, whose design blended influences from various ancient civilizations while keeping a distinct identity of its own. It remains one of the film's most iconic visual achievements. Animal performers also played a significant role. Horses, camels, wolves, and vultures all appeared throughout the film, requiring specialized trainers and adding another layer of complexity to filming. Working with animals often meant delays, unexpected challenges, and moments of unpredictability that tested everyone's patience. The snake sequences involving Thulsa Doom posed their own technical difficulties, since snakes carry important symbolic weight in the story and needed to appear convincing and threatening. The filmmakers used a mix of real snakes and specially designed props to achieve the effect. Conan the Barbarian is often remembered for its action, its memorable characters, and its iconic imagery, but beneath the surface lies a surprisingly sophisticated narrative structure. Rather than following the fast pace of many modern action films, it unfolds like an ancient myth or legendary saga. Director John Milius deliberately crafted the story to feel timeless, letting events develop gradually while emphasizing character growth, atmosphere, and philosophical themes. The result combines personal revenge, epic adventure, spiritual exploration, and heroic transformation into one sweeping journey. The film opens with one of its most important scenes. Before we meet Conan as an adult warrior, we see him as a child living among the Sumerians. His father teaches him about the riddle of steel, a philosophy centered on strength, survival, and understanding the true nature of power. This conversation lays the foundation for everything that follows. The audience may not grasp its full significance right away, but the ideas introduced here shape Conan's journey throughout the film. The story's first major turning point comes soon after, when the peaceful life of Conan's village is shattered by an attack from Thulsa Doom's cult. The raid is brutal and devastating. Conan watches his home destroyed, his people slaughtered, and his parents murdered. This event becomes the defining motivation of his life, and revenge becomes his central purpose from here on. The scene also introduces Thulsa Doom. Although his screen time is limited early on, his presence looms over the whole narrative. The audience immediately senses that he's more than a simple warlord, possessing an almost supernatural ability to inspire devotion and obedience. This early encounter forges a personal connection between hero and villain that gives real emotional weight to their eventual confrontation. After his village is destroyed, Conan is enslaved, marking the beginning of the film's survival and transformation phase. Rather than rushing through this period, The movie lets audiences witness years of hardship as Conan grows from a frightened child into a powerful adult through relentless labor and suffering. He pushes the wheel of pain, endures physical punishment, and gradually builds extraordinary strength. This extended sequence establishes his resilience, shows his ability to overcome adversity, and reinforces the film's emphasis on endurance. Unlike heroes born with special abilities, Conan earns his strength through years of struggle, and watching him evolve physically and mentally deepens the audience's appreciation for what he eventually achieves. The next major turning point comes when Conan is trained as a gladiator, adding a new dimension to his character. No longer just surviving, he starts learning combat skills and experiencing more of the wider world. Through countless battles he becomes a formidable warrior, and these experiences also expose him to knowledge, culture, and new ways of thinking as the narrative gradually widens beyond simple revenge to show his growth as an individual. Eventually Conan earns his freedom, marking the shift from the film's first act into its broader adventure narrative. For the first time, he can choose his own path. Revenge is still his ultimate goal, but he also starts exploring the world and discovering who he is. The story shifts from survival to self-discovery. One of the film's great strengths is how it introduces companions who shape Conan's journey. The first major ally is Subotai, a skilled thief and archer. Their friendship develops naturally through shared experience and mutual respect. Subotai brings intelligence, humor, and emotional support that balance Conan's more serious personality, and together they form a partnership that adds real depth to the story. Soon after, they meet Valeria, a fearless warrior who becomes both an ally and a romantic partner. Her arrival marks another key development. For most of his life Conan has been driven by pain and anger, and Valeria offers him the possibility of happiness, companionship, and a future beyond revenge. Their relationship becomes the emotional center of the film, humanizing Conan and revealing sides of his personality that would otherwise stay hidden. For a while, the narrative shifts away from revenge to focus on friendship, loyalty, and love, providing essential balance against the story's darker elements. The plot then introduces a new goal when King Osric hires the trio to rescue his daughter, who has fallen under the influence of Thulsa Doom's cult. This mission kicks off the story's second major phase. Conan initially takes the job for practical reasons, but it also gives him a chance to pursue the man who destroyed his childhood. Infiltrating Doom's stronghold leads to several crucial developments. Conan finally comes face to face with the man he has hated his whole life, but instead of getting immediate revenge, he discovers Doom's influence and power run far deeper than expected, deepening the conflict and raising the stakes. One of the film's most devastating moments comes when Valeria is killed in an attack by Doom's followers. Her death is the story's emotional low point. Conan loses the person who gave him hope for a different future, and the tragedy reshapes the story once more, intensifying his desire for vengeance while adding profound grief to his motivations. Structurally, Valeria's death functions as a classic Darkest Tower, a stage found in many heroic narratives where the protagonist appears broken, defeated, and emotionally exhausted, making the eventual resolution far more satisfying. What follows is a kind of symbolic death and rebirth for Conan. Part of why Conan the Barbarian has endured for more than 4 decades is that, beneath its surface as a fantasy adventure, it carries a rich set of themes and symbols. Audiences often remember it for its battles, epic landscapes, and larger-than-life characters. But at its core the film grapples with profound questions about human nature, power, destiny, belief, survival, and identity. John Milius deliberately built the story as a mythological journey packed with symbolism that rewards repeated viewing, so the film works on both an entertaining and a philosophical level. Perhaps its most important theme is the search for the true nature of power, introduced in the opening scene through the riddle of steel. Conan's father teaches him that steel is the foundation of strength and survival. Later the Sumerians, weapons represent security, authority, and the ability to protect one's people. Conan initially takes this lesson as absolute truth, but the film gradually challenges it. Throughout his journey, he meets people who hold power without relying on physical strength, and Thulsa Doom is the clearest example. Rather than dominating others through combat, Doom controls them through faith, charisma, manipulation, and ideology, and his followers willingly sacrifice themselves out of belief in him. As the story unfolds, Conan comes to realize that steel itself isn't the ultimate source of power. Weapons are just tools, and the true force behind them is human will. That realization answers the riddle of steel and stands as one of the film's central philosophical conclusions. Power comes from belief, determination, and purpose, not from objects. Closely tied to this is the theme of freedom versus control. Throughout the story, various characters struggle against forms of domination. Conan begins life as a free child but becomes a slave after his village is destroyed, treated as property and forced to labor and fight for others' benefit. His eventual escape symbolizes reclaiming his personal freedom. Thulsa Doom represents a different kind of oppression. Rather than chains and physical restraint, he enslaves minds, and his followers surrender their individuality in exchange for belonging and purpose. This contrast between physical slavery and psychological control gives the film one of its most interesting thematic layers, repeatedly asking whether people truly choose their own destinies or let others shape them. Conan's journey can be read as a struggle to reclaim control over his life after years of manipulation by outside forces. And his final victory matters not just because he defeats Doom, but because he rejects the influence Doom has held over him since childhood. Another major theme is survival through suffering. Few protagonists endure as much hardship as Conan. He watches his parents murdered, loses his home, spends years enslaved, fights as a gladiator, and loses those he loves. Yet he keeps moving forward. The film suggests adversity can either destroy a person or strengthen them, and Conan survives because he refuses to give up. Every challenge becomes part of his growth, and his scars, physical and emotional, shape the hero he ultimately becomes. This theme resonates because it reflects a universal experience. Everyone faces hardship, and Conan's story stands as a symbol of perseverance through overwhelming obstacles. The Wheel of Pain is one of the most powerful symbols tied to this theme. As a child, Conan is forced to push the massive wheel endlessly, and over time it transforms him physically while also symbolizing the burdens and struggles that shape human lives. Rather than breaking him, it becomes part of his growth. Revenge is another central theme driving the narrative. From the moment Thulsa Doom destroys his village, revenge becomes the defining purpose of Conan's life, shaping every decision he makes. But the film presents revenge as a complicated, often destructive force. It gives Conan direction, but also keeps him from fully embracing other possibilities. His relationship with Valeria illustrates this tension. For a brief time he experiences happiness and companionship, yet he can't fully let go of his pursuit of Doom. Ultimately, the story suggests revenge alone can't provide fulfillment. Conan does achieve his goal, but the journey changes him in ways that go beyond vengeance. His growth comes not simply from defeating his enemy, but from discovering deeper truths about himself and the world. Love and loss also play crucial roles. Valeria's relationship with Conan brings emotional vulnerability into a story otherwise dominated by violence and hardship. Through her, he learns trust, companionship, and affection, experiencing genuine happiness for perhaps the first time since childhood. Her death therefore carries enormous symbolic weight, representing the fragility of human connection and the inevitability of loss. Yet even after she's gone, Valeria continues to influence Conan. Her memory gives him strength during moments of despair, showing how love can endure beyond physical existence. The film also explores the tension between civilization and barbarism. On the surface, Conan embodies barbarism. He comes from a tribal culture, relies on physical strength, and often acts on instinct, while many of the cities and kingdoms he encounters represent civilization. But the movie deliberately complicates that distinction. The supposedly civilized societies are often corrupt, decadent, or morally compromised, and Thulsa Doom's cult, despite its organized structure, commits horrific acts. One of the most celebrated aspects of Conan the Barbarian is its extraordinary visual style. Even decades after its 1982 release, it remains one of the most visually distinctive fantasy films ever made. Director John Milius and cinematographer Duke Callahan set out to create a world that felt ancient, mythological, and believable. Rather than relying on flashy fantasy imagery or excessive effects, they built a visual language rooted in realism, epic scale, classical artwork, and historical influence. Every frame designed to make the audience feel they were witnessing a forgotten age from humanity's distant past. From the opening moments, the film establishes a distinct visual identity. The forging of Conan's father's sword is shot with almost religious reverence. The glowing metal, the flying sparks, the careful attention to craftsmanship all communicate the importance of steel to the story. Shot with dramatic lighting and deliberate pacing, a simple act of blacksmithing becomes something symbolic and mythic, and that approach carries through the whole film. Objects are rarely treated as mere props. Swords, armor, temples, and landscapes are photographed in ways that emphasize their significance, with the visual storytelling constantly reinforcing themes of power, destiny, and survival. One of the cinematography's most remarkable qualities is its use of scale. Milius wanted audiences to feel small next to the world surrounding Conan, so wide shots dominate the film. Vast mountains, endless plains, towering fortresses, and immense temples frequently dwarf the characters. These compositions create a sense of grandeur and establish the Hyborian Age as a world far larger than any single hero. The landscape itself becomes almost a character in the story. Filmed mainly in Spain, the natural locations provide an authenticity that would have been impossible to achieve on studio sets. Real sunlight, real mountains, real weather. That realism grounds the fantasy and makes the world feel tangible, unlike many modern fantasy films that lean heavily on digital environments. Lighting plays a crucial role in setting the mood throughout. The cinematography favors natural over artificial illumination. Sunlight dominates outdoor scenes, creating a raw, authentic feel, with daytime sequences often featuring strong contrast between bright skies and rugged terrain that emphasizes the harshness of Conan's world. At night, the visual approach shifts entirely, with firelight becoming a primary light source in many scenes. Torches, campfires, and candles create warm orange tones that contrast sharply with the surrounding darkness, enhancing the historical feel while adding emotional depth. The Temple of Set sequences offer some of the film's most striking imagery, where the lighting turns more theatrical and symbolic. Shadows dominate the frame, creating an atmosphere of mystery and danger, and flickering flames cast unsettling patterns across walls and faces, visually capturing the seductive yet sinister nature of Thulsa Doom's power. Color is another key part of the film's visual design. Unlike many fantasy productions that lean toward bright, vibrant palettes, Conan the Barbarian takes a more restrained approach. Browns, grays, dark greens, and muted blues dominate, creating a grounded, realistic aesthetic that sets it apart from fairy tale fantasy. The world feels ancient, weathered, and lived-in. Costumes look worn rather than pristine, and environments show signs of age and hardship, reinforcing the idea that survival demands constant effort. When brighter colors do appear, they usually carry symbolic weight. Gold, for instance, is tied to wealth, temptation, and power, and the treasures Conan encounters shine dramatically against the darker surroundings to emphasize their allure. Similarly, the reds used in certain battle scenes and rituals evoke danger, violence, and sacrifice. The camera movement throughout is remarkably disciplined. Where modern action films often rely on rapid editing and constant motion, Conan frequently lets scenes unfold with patience, moving deliberately to give audiences time to absorb the environment and the performances. This slower approach adds to the film's mythological atmosphere rather than overwhelming viewers with information. The cinematography invites contemplation, giving every location, costume, and expression room to breathe. It leaves the audience feeling like they're witnessing a legend, not just watching an action sequence. The framing of characters deserves attention too. Conan is frequently positioned to emphasize his physical strength and growing importance in the story. Low-angle shots make him appear larger and more imposing, especially during moments of triumph or confrontation, reinforcing his status as a heroic figure. But the film doesn't rely solely on heroic imagery during moments of vulnerability. After suffering defeat or loss, the camera often places him within larger environments that emphasize his isolation. This contrast lets the audience experience both his strength and his humanity. Thulsa Doom gets equally careful visual treatment. James Earl Jones is often framed centrally, surrounded by followers who reinforce his authority, suggesting a figure at the center of a carefully built system of power. His calm posture and controlled movements contrast sharply with Conan's more physical, instinctive presence. Few films in cinema history have benefited from their music as much as Conan the Barbarian. While praised for its visual grandeur, powerful performances, and mythological storytelling, many critics and fans consider its soundtrack among the greatest ever composed for a fantasy film. Composer Basil Poledouris created a score that does far more than accompany the images on screen. It serves as an essential storytelling tool, shaping emotion, defining characters, building atmosphere, and elevating the whole narrative into something genuinely legendary. Without the score, the film would still be impressive, but it's the combination of image and music that turns it into a true cinematic epic. From the start of production, John Milius understood music would play a crucial role in creating the world of the Hyborian Age. Since Conan speaks relatively little compared to most traditional heroes, much of the emotional storytelling had to come through visual imagery and sound, and Milius believed the score would be key to making audiences feel like they were witnessing an ancient myth. Basil Poledouris was a perfect fit for that challenge. Rather than a simple adventure soundtrack, he approached the film almost like a grand opera, combining orchestral power, emotional depth, heroic themes, and ancient influences into a score that feels timeless and larger than life. One of the soundtrack's most remarkable qualities is how quickly it establishes tone. The opening music accompanying the forging of Conan's father's sword creates a sense of importance and destiny even before the audience understands the story, signaling that they're about to witness something mythological and carrying a sense of history, as if the events on screen belong to a legendary past. Throughout the film, Poledouris uses recurring musical themes tied to specific ideas, characters, and emotions, a technique often called leitmotif, letting the score function almost as a narrative guide, with certain melodies tied to Conan's journey and others representing danger, mystery, or spiritual power. Perhaps the most famous piece in the soundtrack is Anvil of Crom, driven by pounding percussion, triumphant brass, and relentless momentum. It has become one of the most recognizable themes in fantasy cinema, perfectly capturing Conan's strength and determination, a primal, energetic, and unstoppable. What makes it so effective is its ability to convey character through sound alone. Even without dialogue, audiences immediately understand who Conan is, and the music communicates power, resilience, and purpose. Over the decades it has become so iconic that it's frequently referenced in discussions of great epic film scores, and many fans can identify it within seconds. The score's emotional range is another major strength. While the film has plenty of action, the music isn't limited to heroic or aggressive themes. Poldrice shows real versatility, crafting music that expresses tenderness, sadness, wonder, and spirituality. The relationship between Conan and Valeria produces some of the film's richest musical moments, with melodies that feel romantic and sincere without tipping into sentimentality, helping audiences understand that Valeria represents something unique in Conan's life: companionship, hope, and the possibility of happiness beyond revenge. When tragedy strikes later, the score amplifies the emotional impact. Poldrice avoids melodrama and instead uses the music to communicate genuine loss, so the audience feels Conan's grief not just through Schwarzenegger's performance but through the sorrowful orchestral themes accompanying those scenes. The music tied to Thulsa Doom and his cult deserves special mention too. Unlike Conan's themes, which emphasize physical strength and determination, Doom's musical identity feels mysterious, hypnotic, and unsettling, with choral elements creating an atmosphere reminiscent of ancient religious ceremonies. The use of choir throughout is one of the score's most distinctive features, adding a spiritual dimension that reinforces the film's mythological qualities. In scenes involving rituals, temples, and cult gatherings, the choral arrangements create a sense of awe while also suggesting danger, making the audience feel they're witnessing forces larger than ordinary human conflict. This blend of orchestral and vocal music helps establish Thulsa Doom as more than a conventional villain, a symbol of belief, manipulation, and ideological power. And the music around him often feels seductive, echoing his ability to attract devoted followers. One of the score's greatest achievements is its sense of scale. Many fantasy films try to sound epic, but few succeed as completely as this one. Poldrice uses large orchestral arrangements that make the audience feel like entire civilizations are rising and falling, expanding the world beyond what's visible on screen. Battle scenes are a great example. Rather than simply emphasizing violence, the score transforms combat into something almost mythological, so audiences experience clashes of destiny, belief, and survival rather than just people fighting. The music elevates physical conflict into something symbolic. Equally important is the film's use of silence. The soundtrack works so well partly because it isn't constant. Milius and Poldrice understood the value of restraint, letting ambient sounds dominate certain scenes so the musical moments hit even harder. The sound design throughout complements the score beautifully. Every sword strike, footstep, animal cry, and ambient sound adds to the immersive experience, since the filmmakers wanted audiences to feel physically present in the Hyborian Age. When Conan the Barbarian was released in 1982, it entered a very different cinematic landscape than the one we know today. Fantasy films weren't yet a major box office force, and a serious, large-scale sword and sorcery epic still looked like a gamble to many industry observers. As a result, the initial reception was mixed, and many viewers embraced its unique style right away, while some critics struggled with what the film was trying to do. Over time, though, it underwent one of the more remarkable critical re-evaluations in fantasy cinema, going from a somewhat controversial release to a widely respected classic. At the time of its premiere, Arnold Schwarzenegger's performance was one of the most discussed aspects of the film. He was still relatively unknown as a movie actor, recognized mainly as a bodybuilding champion, so many critics approached the film skeptically, questioning whether he had the acting range to carry a major picture. His strong Austrian accent and sparse dialogue were common topics, as some critics saw these as weaknesses, arguing he lacked the traditional qualities of a Hollywood leading man. Others felt his performance suited the material perfectly, noting that Conan wasn't meant to be a sophisticated intellectual hero but a mythological warrior whose physical presence said more than words could. Over the years, Many critics came to appreciate how well Schwarzenegger embodied the role, and what some initially saw as limitations eventually became part of its appeal. The film's visual style earned significant praise from both critics and audiences. Even reviewers with reservations about other elements often acknowledged the impressive production values of the landscapes, practical sets, costumes, and cinematography all drew widespread admiration, and many critics singled out the film's epic scale. Unlike many fantasy productions of the era, Conan the Barbarian felt expansive and ambitious, and the vast Spanish locations, large battle sequences, and detailed world-building set it apart from competing films. Viewers often described it as immersive and visually striking. Basil Poledouris's soundtrack received especially enthusiastic praise from the start, and many critics called out the music as one of the film's greatest strengths, admiring its emotional power, grand orchestration, and ability to elevate the narrative. Over the decades it's become one of the most universally admired parts of the movie. Even critics who disliked other aspects often acknowledged the brilliance of Poledouris's work, and today the score is frequently ranked among the greatest fantasy soundtracks ever made and considered a landmark in film music. One of the main criticisms during the original release involved the film's violence. Compared to most fantasy films of the early 80s, Conan was unusually brutal, featuring sword fights, decapitations, executions, and scenes of physical suffering that some reviewers found excessive. Several critics argued the violence risked overshadowing the story or even glorified brutality, concerns especially common among reviewers who preferred fantasy aimed at younger audiences. Supporters countered that the violence served a real narrative purpose. Conan's world is harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving, and the brutality reflects that reality while reinforcing themes of survival and endurance. Over time, many viewers came to see the violence as essential to the film's identity rather than a flaw. The pacing also divided critics. Modern audiences used to rapid editing and constant action might be surprised that some early reviewers found Conan slow. The film takes its time building atmosphere, character, and world, with long stretches of minimal dialogue that rely on visual storytelling and music instead. Some critics found this refreshing and artistic, others thought it hurt the film's momentum. With hindsight, many supporters argue the deliberate pacing is actually one of its greatest strengths, letting audiences absorb the mythology and appreciate Conan's gradual transformation. The film's philosophical elements also generated mixed reactions. Milius packed the screenplay with discussions of power, destiny, strength, and belief, with the riddle of steel serving as a recurring philosophical framework. Some reviewers appreciated these deeper themes and saw the film as smarter than a typical action-adventure. Others found the philosophy overly serious or pretentious. Interestingly, these same themes have become one of the main reasons modern audiences keep discussing the film. What once divided critics now feeds its reputation. Audience reactions during the original release were generally more positive than the critical reviews. Many moviegoers embraced the adventure, action, and larger-than-life storytelling, and fantasy fans in particular responded enthusiastically to the film's unique atmosphere and mythological tone. It performed well at the box office, proving that audiences would support ambitious fantasy productions, and that financial success helped show studios that sword and sorcery adventures could reach mainstream viewers, encouraging further investment in similar projects throughout the decade. Repeat viewership was also a major factor in its growing popularity, and many fans returned to theaters multiple times, drawn back by the soundtrack, visuals, and memorable characters. And the movie quickly built a dedicated following that kept growing after its theatrical run. Few fantasy films have left a legacy as significant and far-reaching as Conan the Barbarian. When it premiered in 1982, it was seen mainly as a bold adaptation of a popular literary character and a big break for an emerging actor named Arnold Schwarzenegger. Over the following decades, though, the film grew into something much bigger, with influence spreading across cinema, television, literature, comics, video games, music, fitness culture, and the broader perception of fantasy storytelling itself. Today it's recognized not just as a successful movie but as a genuine cultural landmark. Perhaps the most obvious part of its legacy is how it turned Arnold Schwarzenegger into an international star. Before Conan, he was famous mainly within the bodybuilding world, and despite a handful of earlier film appearances, few people saw him as a serious contender for Hollywood stardom. Conan changed that. The film proved Schwarzenegger had a screen presence unlike any other actor of his era, and his physicality, charisma, and knack for embodying larger-than-life characters immediately grabbed audiences. Without Conan's success, it's hard to imagine Schwarzenegger getting the opportunities that followed. Just 2 years later he starred in The Terminator, a role that cemented his place among cinema's biggest action stars, and from there came Predator, Commando, Total Recall, True Lies, and many other blockbusters. Many films contributed to his career, but Conan remains the foundation it was built on. The film also played a crucial role in shaping the sword and sorcery genre. Fantasy stories had existed for centuries, but Conan the Barbarian established a cinematic template that many later productions tried to follow. Its mix of muscular heroes, ancient civilizations, dark magic, brutal combat, and mythological themes became one of the defining formulas of 1980s fantasy entertainment. Studios rushed to develop similar projects afterward, including Red Sonja, The Beastmaster, Cruel, Hawk the Slayer, and other fantasy adventures. Some found moderate success while others faded quickly, but almost all were influenced in some way by the path Conan had carved out. Even movies with a very different tone borrowed elements it had introduced or popularized, and the image of a lone warrior traveling through a dangerous world of monsters, sorcery, and ancient ruins became a recurring feature of fantasy cinema, with many filmmakers consciously trying to recapture its atmosphere and visual style. The film's influence extends well beyond cinema. In literature, Conan's popularity introduced new generations of readers to Robert E. Howard's original stories, and sales of Howard's books rose significantly after the film's release, helping preserve the character's place in fantasy literature. Many modern fantasy authors cite Conan as an important influence, and his blend of physical strength, survival instincts, and personal freedom became a model for countless heroes in novels from the 1980s onward. The popularity of darker, more rugged fantasy protagonists owes a lot to Conan's enduring appeal. Comic books saw a similar boost. Conan had already found success in comic form before the movie, but the film dramatically expanded public awareness of the character, drawing new readers to comic adaptations and original stories and strengthening the franchise's cultural standing. Fantasy illustrators were equally influenced. The imagery of Conan standing atop battlefields, confronting monsters, or holding massive swords became iconic, and countless paintings, book covers, posters, and fantasy artworks have borrowed from the film's aesthetic. Even today, fantasy artists continue referencing its visual style. Video games represent one of the most profound areas of influence. Throughout gaming history, countless characters and worlds have drawn inspiration from Conan the Barbarian, and the muscular warrior archetype became a staple of fantasy games across generations. Many action and RPG titles feature heroes resembling Conan in appearance, personality, or narrative role. Big swords, ancient kingdoms, barbarian cultures, and stories built on survival and revenge became common gaming tropes. Developers often bring their own innovations, but Conan's influence remains visible, and the fantasy role-playing genre in particular rose at a considerable debt. Many players and designers embraced the darker, more mature style of fantasy Conan helped popularize, and its depiction of dangerous worlds full of mystery and violence lined up closely with what many gamers were looking for in their adventures. Television has benefited from Conan's legacy as well. Long before fantasy became a dominant force on TV, Conan showed that audiences were willing to embrace serious fantasy storytelling. Decades later, large-scale fantasy series achieved global success, but they entered a landscape Conan had already helped shape how many productions adopted its approach to world-building, character design, and atmosphere, and the idea that fantasy settings could feel realistic, dangerous, and emotionally complex became increasingly common. Conan helped pave the way for later creators to explore fantasy with greater ambition and sophistication. Even fitness culture felt the film's influence. Schwarzenegger's Conan became one of the defining physical ideals of the 1980s, and his muscular physique inspired countless people to start weight training and bodybuilding. Gyms grew more popular during the decade, and Conan's image regularly appeared in fitness magazines and promotional materials. One of the most fascinating things about Conan the Barbarian is how differently generations of audiences have interpreted it. Since its 1982 release, viewers have connected with the story for many different reasons. Some see it as the ultimate fantasy adventure, others as a philosophical exploration of power, freedom, and destiny. Some remember it mainly as the film that launched Schwarzenegger's career, while others regard it as one of the great examples of mythological storytelling ever put on screen. That capacity to support multiple interpretations is one of the key reasons it has stayed relevant for more than 40 years. For audiences who saw it during its original theatrical run, Conan the Barbarian felt genuinely unusual and exciting. Fantasy cinema was far less common in the early 1980s than it is now. Science fiction had already found mainstream popularity, but large-scale fantasy adventures remained fairly rare. Conan felt fresh, offering a world unlike anything else in mainstream cinema at the time. Many viewers were struck by its scale, the enormous landscapes, towering sets, epic battles, and powerful music combined to create a genuinely grand experience, and audiences often described the film as immersive, as though they'd been transported into an ancient, dangerous, mysterious world. For younger audiences of the era, Conan became a symbol of adventure and heroism. Many children and teens were captivated by a warrior overcoming impossible odds through sheer determination and courage. And Conan's journey from orphaned slave to legendary hero resonated because it reflected universal dreams of personal transformation. Older viewers often connected on a deeper level, recognizing themes of suffering, perseverance, and self-discovery that reflected challenges familiar to many adults. The idea that hardship can shape a person's character carried real emotional weight beyond the fantasy setting. One of the most common audience reactions is admiration for Conan's resilience. Throughout the film he endures extraordinary losses and setbacks: the destruction of his family, years of slavery, the deaths of people he loves, repeated overwhelming odds, yet he refuses to give up. Many viewers find this quality genuinely inspiring, and Conan's determination has become a symbol of perseverance in the face of adversity. Audiences often read the story as a reminder that people can survive even the hardest circumstances, a message that resonates because it reflects a universal human experience. Another frequent topic of discussion is the character's simplicity. Unlike many modern heroes defined by witty dialogue or complex psychological analysis, Conan communicates much of his personality through action. Some viewers initially saw this as an imitation, but many came to appreciate it as one of the character's strengths. His straightforward nature lets audiences project their own experiences and interpretations onto him. He functions almost like a mythological figure rather than a conventional movie protagonist, and his struggles become symbolic as much as personal, so different viewers often see different parts of themselves reflected in his journey. The relationship between Conan and Valeria has generated strong emotional responses from audiences over the years. Many viewers see this portion of the story as its emotional core. For much of his life, Conan is driven by revenge and survival, and Valeria introduces the possibility of happiness, companionship, and love. When tragedy strikes, audiences often describe the loss as one of the film's most powerful moments, and the emotional impact holds up because the relationship feels genuine. Conan isn't just losing a companion, he's losing the future he'd briefly imagined for himself. Many viewers read the storyline as a reflection of life's unpredictability. Happiness can appear unexpectedly, but it can also vanish without warning. And the film's willingness to embrace that reality adds to its emotional depth and maturity. Thulsa has inspired a wide range of interpretations too. Some see him as a traditional fantasy antagonist, others as an embodiment of ideological manipulation and psychological control. His ability to get people to follow him willingly often sparks discussion, and many modern viewers draw parallels between Doom and real-world figures who use charisma, belief systems, or persuasive rhetoric to gain influence. As a result, the character remains surprisingly relevant, with different generations continuing to recognize elements of contemporary society in his methods of control. One of the most debated aspects of the film involves its themes of strength and power. Some audiences read Conan the Barbarian as a celebration of physical strength and personal independence, admiring Conan for refusing to be controlled and relying on his own abilities to overcome challenges. Others focus on the philosophical lessons woven throughout, arguing the film ultimately rejects the idea that physical strength alone is enough. The answer to the riddle of steel suggests true power comes from human will, belief, and determination rather than weapons or muscle. These differing readings have contributed significantly to the film's longevity, since it never offers simplistic answers. Audiences are still debating its meaning decades later. The visual presentation has played a major role in shaping these reactions too. Many viewers remember specific images long after forgetting plot details, and moments like Conan standing atop a battlefield, the Wheel of Pain, the Temple of Set, and the final confrontation with Thulsa have all become iconic. One of Conan the Barbarian's greatest strengths is the way it develops its characters through experience rather than exposition. Unlike many modern films that lean heavily on dialogue to explain motivations and emotions, Conan often lets growth emerge through actions, choices, and consequences. The characters evolve naturally as they face hardship, temptation, loss, friendship, and destiny. At the center of the story is Conan himself, whose transformation from helpless child to legendary hero forms the film's emotional and thematic backbone, though the supporting characters also play vital roles in shaping both the narrative and Conan's development. Conan begins the story as an innocent child living among the Sumerians, with no extraordinary abilities and no understanding of the suffering that awaits him. His father teaches him the riddle of steel, introducing the idea that strength and survival are closely linked. A philosophical foundation for his journey, even though as a child he lacks the life experience to fully understand it. The destruction of his village marks his first major turning point. In a matter of moments he loses everything: his parents murdered, his home destroyed, his future stolen. That trauma defines the rest of his life, pushing him out of innocence and into a world of suffering and survival. The years of slavery that follow shape his character profoundly. Physically, relentless labor and combat training make him stronger. More importantly, he develops extraordinary endurance. Many people would have broken under such experiences, but Conan learns to endure without surrendering, and that resilience becomes one of his defining traits. At this stage, though, he's driven mainly by instinct rather than wisdom. His life revolves around survival, and he hasn't yet developed a deeper understanding of the world or his place in it. with revenge remaining the central force behind his actions. The gladiator phase introduces another stage of growth. Conan starts encountering different cultures, learning new skills, and gaining exposure to ideas beyond his childhood experience. He builds combat expertise, but he also gains knowledge as the film subtly suggests he's becoming more than just a weapon, beginning to think, observe, and question. When he finally wins his freedom, he enters a period of self-discovery. For the first time he can choose his own path, and that freedom forces him to figure out who he wants to become. Revenge is still his main objective, but he also starts building relationships and exploring possibilities beyond violence. The friendship between Conan and Subotai plays a crucial role in this transformation. Subotai becomes more than a companion. He's one of the first people Conan genuinely trusts, and their bond shows Conan's capacity for loyalty and friendship. During his years of slavery, trust had been largely irrelevant. Since survival demanded self-reliance, Subotai teaches him the value of partnership, and through their adventures Conan learns that strength doesn't have to be solitary. Friendship provides support, perspective, and emotional connection, a lesson that grows more important as the story progresses. Valeria represents perhaps the most significant influence on Conan's emotional development. Before meeting her, his life is largely defined by pain and vengeance. She introduces something entirely different, a love. Their relationship reveals sides of his personality that had stayed hidden until then. With Valeria, Conan experiences happiness, companionship, and vulnerability, and begins imagining a future not solely focused on revenge. For a brief time he seems capable of escaping the shadow of his past. And this development matters because it shows Conan is more than a warrior seeking vengeance. He's capable of growth, affection, and emotional depth. That makes the tragedy of Valeria's death one of the most important moments in his arc. The loss devastates him, but also forces him to confront the consequences of his choices, since his obsession with Thal Sadum has brought suffering not just to himself but to those he cares about. At this point Conan reaches his lowest emotional state, physically wounded, emotionally broken, spiritually exhausted. In many heroic narratives, this stage functions as a kind of symbolic death of the hero, who must lose everything before achieving true transformation. The healing sequence that follows works as a form of rebirth. Conan emerges with a deeper understanding of himself and the world. While revenge is still important to him, it's no longer his only purpose, and he begins recognizing larger truths about power, belief, and destiny. By the time he confronts Thal Sadum in the final act, Conan has become a fundamentally different person from the child who witnessed his village's destruction. A stronger, wiser, more loyal, more self-aware, and, most importantly, someone who has found the answer to the riddle of steel. Power doesn't live in weapons alone, but in the will of the individual. His final victory represents more than revenge, it symbolizes personal liberation. Conan is no longer controlled by the trauma of his past. He defeats the man who shaped his life and finally claims ownership of his own destiny. Thal Sadum's arc functions as an interesting counterpoint to Conan's. Unlike Conan, Doom begins the story with immense power, commanding followers, controlling vast resources, and exerting influence over countless people. On the surface, almost invincible. But his power depends entirely on others' belief in him. He presents himself throughout as a godlike figure, but beneath that surface he remains vulnerable to the loss of faith. And as Conan grows stronger and more independent, Doom becomes increasingly exposed. The climax reveals just how fragile his authority really is. One of the most impressive achievements of Conan the Barbarian is its extraordinary costume and set design. Long before CGI became the dominant tool for building fantasy worlds, the filmmakers relied on practical craftsmanship to bring the Hyborian age to life. Every costume, weapon, piece of armor, temple, village, and fortress was carefully designed to create a believable world that felt ancient, dangerous, and authentic, and the result is one of the most visually immersive fantasy environments ever put on film. More than 40 years later, the production design remains one of the film's most celebrated strengths and a major reason it still feels timeless. From the start of production, John Milius wanted to avoid the artificial look often associated with fantasy films. Rather than a fairy tale world of colorful, decorative costumes, he envisioned a harsh, brutal age where survival was difficult and comfort scarce, a philosophy that shaped every part of the film's visual design. The costume department leaned heavily into realism, clothing looks worn, weathered, and functional, and characters dress according to their environment, occupation, and social status, helping audiences believe these people genuinely lived in this world. Conan's costumes are a clear example of character-driven design, evolving alongside his personal journey. As a child, he wears simple garments reflecting the humble lifestyle of the Sumerian people, establishing his origins and the simplicity of his upbringing. After his capture and enslavement, his clothing becomes minimal and utilitarian, reflecting his lost freedom and identity, treated as property rather than a person. The visual simplicity reinforces just how much he's been stripped of. As he grows into adulthood and gains freedom, his wardrobe gradually changes, still practical, but now reflecting his role as a warrior and adventurer, with leather, fur, and metal becoming more prominent to communicate strength, resilience, and adaptability. Part of why his look became so iconic is the balance between fantasy and realism. His costumes look functional rather than decorative, and audiences can imagine such clothing actually being worn in a harsh environment, which adds to the character's credibility. Schwarzenegger's physique also influenced the costume design. Rather than hiding his physical presence beneath elaborate armor, many of Conan's costumes were built to showcase his strength while still staying believable within the story. Valeria's costume design is equally significant. In many fantasy films of the era, female characters were dressed to prioritize appearance over practicality. Conan the Barbarian took a different approach. Valeria's costumes are visually striking, but they also reflect her identity as a skilled warrior. Her clothing allows freedom of movement and looks suited to combat and travel, communicating independence and competence. Audiences immediately understand she's capable of surviving in the same dangerous world as Conan, and this visual consistency strengthens her character and helps explain why she became one of the most respected female figures in fantasy cinema. Sabotai's wardrobe reflects his personality and skill set as well, emphasizing mobility, stealth, and practicality. Unlike Conan, whose look projects physical power, Sabotai's clothing suggests agility and adaptability, subtle differences that help distinguish the characters visually while reinforcing their distinct roles in the story. Thulsa Doom's costume design operates on an entirely different level. While Conan and his companions wear practical survival gear, Doom's appearance emphasizes authority, mysticism, and control. His robes and ceremonial garments project spiritual power rather than physical dominance, and the rich textures and elaborate details set him apart from ordinary people. He seems almost otherworldly, reinforcing his followers' view of him as more than a mere man. His costumes add significantly to his aura of mystery and charisma, and the serpent imagery woven into his design subtly ties him to the snake symbolism that defines his cult, strengthening the thematic link between the character and ideas of temptation, manipulation, and corruption. The film's armor design deserves special recognition too. Unlike many fantasy productions that favor highly decorative or unrealistic armor, Conan the Barbarian generally goes for designs that feel functional and believable. Different groups have distinct visual identities that help audiences understand their culture and social structure, and the armor worn by warriors from various regions reflects differences in resources, traditions, and military practices. This attention to world building creates a richer, more convincing setting even background characters help sustain the illusion of a fully developed civilization. Weapons get the same level of care. Swords, axes, spears, and bows aren't just props but important extensions of character identity. Conan's famous sword has become one of the most recognizable weapons in fantasy cinema, its design communicating strength, craftsmanship, and historical weight. The filmmakers understood that weapons carry symbolic meaning here, as the sword represents power, survival, and the philosophical questions tied to the riddle of steel. So considerable effort went into making these objects look authentic and meaningful. The set design is, if anything, even more impressive than the costumes, with the production building enormous practical environments rather than relying primarily on visual effects. While Conan the Barbarian is often remembered for its action, visuals, and music, one of its most underrated strengths is its screenplay, written by John Milius and Oliver Stone with significant revisions during development. The script stands apart from many fantasy films because it relies less on constant dialogue and more on mythological storytelling rather than overwhelming audiences with exposition. It lets silence, imagery, and atmosphere carry much of the narrative weight, resulting in dialogue that feels purposeful, memorable, and surprisingly philosophical. One of the script's most distinctive qualities is its confidence in visual storytelling. Modern films often explain every detail through conversation, but Conan the Barbarian frequently lets audiences interpret events for themselves. Characters rarely discuss their emotions directly, communicating feelings instead through actions, expressions, and choices. This is especially true for Conan himself, who speaks far less than most traditional protagonists. Some viewers might assume at first glance that this reflects Schwarzenegger's limited acting experience at the time, but the screenplay deliberately embraces his character's reserved nature. Conan isn't a philosopher who enjoys long conversations. He's a man shaped by hardship, slavery, and survival, and his words carry weight precisely because he uses them sparingly. When he speaks, audiences pay attention because the dialogue feels earned rather than routine. The script also benefits from its mythological structure. Much of the dialogue echoes the language of ancient legends, heroic epics, and historical sagas, giving the characters a timeless quality rather than sounding like ordinary people having everyday conversations. They often speak in ways that feel symbolic, philosophical, or prophetic, which adds significantly to the film's sense of grandeur. The opening conversation between Conan and his father is one of the best examples of the screenplay's thematic depth. On the surface it's simple, a father teaching his son about strength and survival, but the dialogue serves a much larger purpose. Introducing the riddle of steel and posing questions, the story spends the next 2 hours exploring: what is true power? What gives human beings strength? Can weapons alone determine destiny? These questions stay relevant throughout the film and eventually lead Conan to a deeper understanding of himself and the world, showing how effectively this early scene plants ideas that keep developing long after the conversation ends. Perhaps the film's most famous line comes when Conan is asked what's best in life. His response has become one of the most quoted pieces of dialogue in fantasy and action cinema, not simply because it sounds powerful, but because it perfectly captures his worldview at that point in the story. His answer reflects someone who has survived unimaginable suffering and learned to value victory above all else, and in just a few sentences it gives audiences real insight into his personality, priorities, and experience, information that might otherwise take much longer scenes to establish. Thulsa Doom's dialogue is another major strength of the screenplay. Unlike Conan, Doom relies heavily on words. His power comes not from physical dominance but from his ability to persuade, manipulate, and inspire. Many of his speeches carry a hypnotic quality. He speaks calmly and confidently, presenting dangerous ideas as undeniable truths, and the screenplay carefully builds his dialogue to explain why people follow him. That's part of why he remains such an effective villain. He isn't simply evil, he understands human desires and fears, and through language he convinces others to give up their independence in exchange for purpose and belonging. His conversations with Conan matter especially because they represent a clash between two philosophies. Conan believes in personal strength and individual will, while Doom believes controlling minds is the ultimate form of power. Their dialogue turns the story from a simple revenge tale into a debate about the nature of authority itself. Valeria's dialogue contributes significantly to her characterization too. She speaks with confidence, intelligence, and independence, and unlike many female characters in early 1980s fantasy films, she's never reduced to a passive role. Her conversations with Conan reveal emotional depth while preserving her strength. The screenplay never makes her merely a romantic interest, giving her instead her own desires, fears, and motivations as a fully realized individual. Her exchanges with Conan also provide some of the film's most human moments, letting audiences see a side of him that rarely appears elsewhere. Sabotai serves a different purpose in the screenplay, often introducing humor, perspective, and practicality. While Conan tends to focus on bigger goals and personal struggles, Sabotai grounds the story in everyday concerns, which helps keep the film from becoming overly serious. His comments provide moments of relief without undercutting the dramatic tension, and his dialogue helps build the sense of camaraderie that strengthens the bonds among the main characters. One of the screenplay's most impressive qualities is its use of silence. Many scenes contain little or no dialogue at all, yet rather than feeling empty, these moments often become some of the most powerful parts of the film. The years Conan spends pushing the wheel of pain, for example, need very few words as the audience understands his suffering through visual storytelling and music alone. Similarly, several action sequences rely primarily on movement and atmosphere rather than conversation. The marketing campaign for Conan the Barbarian is a fascinating chapter in film promotion history. Released in 1982, it entered theaters during an era of Hollywood marketing very different from today's. No social media, viral videos, influencer partnerships, or digital ads. Instead, studios relied on posters, TV commercials, magazine coverage, newspaper ads, trailers, merchandise, and public appearances to build interest. Despite those limitations, the marketing team successfully turned Conan the Barbarian from a risky fantasy project into one of the most talked about releases of its year. One of the biggest challenges facing marketers was introducing Conan to mainstream audiences. Robert E. Howard's character had a loyal following among readers and comic book fans, but many moviegoers had little or no familiarity with him. So the campaign needed to do two things at once: hold on to existing fans while convincing general audiences that Conan was worth their time. The solution was fairly straightforward. Rather than emphasizing the character's literary origins, the marketing leaned into spectacle, adventure, and larger-than-life heroism, presenting Conan as a mythic warrior unlike anything audiences had seen. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat at the center of the campaign. He wasn't yet the global superstar he'd become, but marketers quickly recognized his extraordinary physique as a major selling point. He looked dramatically different from most actors of the period, and his appearance instantly communicated strength, power, and physical dominance. Promotional photos frequently highlighted this, with posters, magazine features, and ads often putting Schwarzenegger front and center to showcase the qualities that made him uniquely suited for the role. Even viewers unfamiliar with the character could instantly tell Conan was a formidable warrior. The film's theatrical poster became one of the most iconic pieces of movie marketing from the 1980s. The artwork typically showed Conan standing triumphantly with a sword, often surrounded by dramatic fantasy imagery, with a composition emphasizing strength, adventure, and epic scale. Designed to resemble classic fantasy paintings and pulp magazine covers, the artistic style instantly signaled a genre while presenting the film as a serious, ambitious production rather than a lightweight fantasy adventure. Decades later, many collectors still consider the original Conan poster one of the most memorable movie posters ever made. The campaign also benefited from the broader popularity of fantasy artwork in the late 70s and early 80s. Illustrated fantasy novels, comics, and role-playing games had already built an audience that appreciated heroic imagery, and the promotional materials tapped directly into that visual tradition. Trailers played an equally important role in building anticipation. Rather than revealing too much of the story, the theatrical previews emphasized the film's scale, action sequences, and epic atmosphere, focusing on creating excitement and curiosity while showcasing the impressive locations, battle scenes, and visual spectacle. Audiences were invited into a mysterious world of warriors, temples, sorcery, and danger. The trailers presented Conan not merely as a movie, but as an event. Music served as a powerful marketing tool. Even here Basil Poledrice's score helped establish the film's identity, with dramatic orchestral compositions that immediately set Conan apart from competing films and reinforced the impression that audiences were in for something epic. Television advertising expanded the campaign's reach. Short commercials highlighted the film's most visually striking moments while emphasizing Schwarzenegger's presence, focusing on action, sword fights, and memorable imagery designed to grab attention fast. These spots proved especially effective because fantasy cinema was still relatively uncommon. Now many viewers had never seen anything quite like Conan, and its unusual visual style helped it stand out among other ads of the period. Magazine coverage was another major piece of the promotional strategy. Schwarzenegger did numerous interviews and feature articles about the film, and his background as a bodybuilding champion gave journalists a compelling story to tell. Many articles focused on his transition from professional athlete to movie star, which helped humanize the campaign and gave audiences a reason to invest in the film beyond its fantasy setting. Fitness magazines played a particularly important role, since Schwarzenegger was already a legendary figure within the bodybuilding community and his fans represented a built-in audience for the movie. Coverage in fitness publications introduced Conan to readers who might not otherwise have paid attention to fantasy cinema, and the connection between bodybuilding and the film became a significant promotional advantage. Audiences were fascinated by Schwarzenegger's physical transformation and training methods, and his image as Conan helped reinforce the growing popularity of fitness culture throughout the 1980s. To really understand the significance of Conan the Barbarian, it helps to compare it with other fantasy films, other adaptations of Robert E. Howard's work, and other films by director John Milius. Doing so shows why Conan stands apart from many of its contemporaries and why it continues to be regarded as one of the most influential fantasy films ever made. Countless movies have tried to replicate its success, but very few have matched its combination of mythological depth, visual authenticity, philosophical themes, and emotional power. One obvious comparison is with the other sword and sorcery films of the 1980s. Following Conan's commercial success, Hollywood produced a wave of fantasy adventures featuring warriors, magic, monsters, and ancient kingdoms. Films like The Beastmaster, Cruel, Red Sonja, Hawk the Slayer, and Deathstalker. Many built loyal fan bases, but Conan set itself apart through its seriousness and ambition. Most fantasy films of the era prioritized entertainment above all else. Conan, by contrast, treated its material almost as mythology, unfolding with the structure of an ancient legend rather than a conventional action-adventure. The Beastmaster, for example, offers a fantasy world full of adventure and supernatural elements, but its tone is lighter and more accessible. Conan feels darker, more philosophical, and more grounded, encouraging audiences to contemplate power, destiny, and belief rather than simply follow the hero's journey. Cruel similarly blends fantasy and science fiction in an imaginative setting but leans into a more traditional fairy tale approach. Conan avoids those conventions, creating a world that feels ancient, harsh, and believable, and that realism contributes significantly to its lasting appeal. The most direct comparison is probably Red Sonja, released in 1985, which was clearly meant to capitalize on Conan's popularity and even featured Schwarzenegger in a supporting role. Despite the similarities, it received a far more mixed reception, largely because of tone. Red Sonja takes a more family-friendly approach with greater emphasis on adventure and spectacle, while Conan the Barbarian embraces darker themes, more mature storytelling, and greater emotional depth. As a result, many viewers consider Conan the superior film despite the shared setting. Conan the Destroyer offers an equally revealing comparison. Released in 1984, the sequel reunited Schwarzenegger with the character but took a noticeably different approach. Where the original feels mythological and serious, the sequel leans more toward adventure and humor, with more colorful visuals, lighter dialogue, and a broader tone meant to appeal to a wider audience. Some fans enjoyed its entertainment value, but many feel it lacks the philosophical depth and emotional resonance of the original. That contrast highlights part of why Conan the Barbarian remains so respected. It refuses to compromise its artistic vision, fully committing to its mythological identity instead of simplifying its themes for broader appeal. Comparisons with fantasy literature adaptations are also worth noting. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, released decades later, shares certain qualities with Conan: detailed fantasy worlds, epic journeys, conflicts involving power and destiny, but the two differ significantly in tone and perspective. The Lord of the Rings focuses on collective heroism, friendship, and the struggle between good and evil on a grand scale, while Conan is far more personal, centered on one individual's quest for meaning, freedom, and revenge. Conan's world is morally ambiguous, with characters often acting on practical concerns rather than clear ethical principles, giving the film a distinct identity within the genre. Modern fantasy television offers an interesting comparison too. Series like Game of Thrones share Conan's willingness to depict violence, political manipulation, and harsh realities, and both reject the idea that fantasy has to be sanitized or idealized. In many ways, Conan anticipated the darker direction fantasy storytelling would eventually take long before audiences embraced morally complex fantasy narratives. Conan proved viewers were willing to engage with mature themes in a fantastical setting. The movie's relationship to Robert E. Howard's original stories deserves special mention as well. While Conan the Barbarian draws on Howard's work, it isn't a direct adaptation of any single story. It combines elements from multiple sources while introducing original material, which has fueled decades of fan debate. Some readers argue the film's Conan differs significantly from Howard's literary character in the original stories. Conan is often more talkative, cunning, and intellectually capable than the version Schwarzenegger portrays on screen. Others argue the movie successfully captures the spirit of Howard's work even where it changes specific details, pointing to its themes of survival, freedom, barbarism, and individual strength as evidence of a faithful adaptation of the author's core ideas. Ultimately, the comparison illustrates the broader challenge of bringing literary characters to the screen.